and welcome to Surroundscapes, a video and audio podcast series that covers the world of commercial AV, hosted by Blue Sound Professional. In this episode, I'm delighted to be able to welcome back a previous podcast guest and a great friend of mine, Julian Treasure. He has a wonderful new book called Sound Effects that I've been reading. Here's my copy of advanced copy of it, annotated. And it's about all elements of sound. I'd say it's a love letter to the sense of sound, to listening, to speaking, to everything to do with sound. That's what drew me to Julian in the first place. He was the first person I'd ever met that built a business, a career, a world out of the sense of sound, how it impacted business, how it impacts all of us. So welcome back, Julian. And I'd like to ask you to begin with about your history. What brought you to where you are now?
Well, thank you, Graham. It's always a pleasure to see you and chat to you. And I'm delighted to be back, and particularly to talk about this book, which is kind of my life's work, really, on paper or a screen, depending on how you, or your ears, because I just recorded the audiobook as well. My story, well, I started playing an instrument very young. I grew up in an era where albums, vinyl, was the way you listened to music. And I was lucky enough to have a mother who kind of inculcated me at a very young age with classical music, you know, things like A Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra, Carnival of the Animals, Peter and the Wolf, those kind of things, which I listened to avidly and loved. And obviously a few years later, I branched out into my own particular forms of music, you know, pop and then prog and so forth. And, you know, so the early 70s, I was lucky enough to be, you know, 14 years old in 1972 when Close to the Edge came out and Thick as a Brick came out and all these kind of classic prog albums. So there I was sitting in darkened rooms with headphones on, avidly listening still to music. And I kind of started a love affair with music then through my early childhood, took up an instrument. I started to learn to play the drums and then eventually played in bands. And so I think I developed a listening, which, you know, I write about this in the book, is different, I think, for musicians compared to non-musicians. And the research bears that out, actually, that musicians have a more developed corpus callosum, the bit of the brain that joins the two hemispheres together. Because if you think about, let's just say, a classical violinist, what they're doing is amazing. They're decoding dots on paper, which is not a simple process, for anybody who's learned to read music will tell you. So they're decoding that at the same time as making a lot of extremely complex movements with their hands, arms, and so forth, at the same time as listening to the whole rest of the orchestra and paying attention to the conductor, of course. And that attentive multi-channel listening that musicians develop is essential. If you're going to play in a group, a band, an orchestra, you must listen to all the other instruments at the same time and very attentively while you're doing some very complicated other things. So it's not surprising to me. I think Oliver Sacks says in one of his books that anybody who is doing a post-mortem would be able to tell the brain of a musician from every other kind of brain because of this, you know, very, very significant development. And actually the research now shows that playing an instrument is very good for people in lots of ways. It's not just good for playing music, but it makes people faster to solve problems. Their reasoning is faster. They're more agile, you know, all sorts of things. So I do urge anybody listening to this, it's never too late. Take up an instrument, even if it's singing in a choir, join a drum circle, whatever you can do. It's never too late to learn something, and it's good for you. So that was what happened to me. And I took that listening into a longish career. I mean, I was a musician for a while. I was a professional drummer for a bit, then got very broke, as most people do, unless they're very lucky or very brilliant. And I ended up selling advertising space in the computer publishing industry. And I worked my way up in that company and then another company to become marketing director of a publishing company, and then left it to launch my own business back in 1988. So that was a company called TPD, and it became very successful and had offices in Seattle, not far from you, in Munich and in London, producing magazines, customer magazines for Microsoft, Apple, Orange, all sorts of Lexus, all sorts of lovely companies. And I sold that in 2002. And then I was able to kind of bring the two halves of me together, because all that time I'd understood marketing, brands, communication, but I'd been thinking, where's the sound? Well, these people don't care. There's no companies saying, how does our brand sound? So I started a company called the Sound Agency in 2003, and I ran that for 20 years, just over 20 years. So that's audio branding, which is exactly asking the question, how does your brand sound, and answering it for people, which produces sounds like sonic logos. Everybody knows Intel's da-da-da-da. I don't think many people could draw Intel's logo, but most people could sing it. And that's worth hundreds of billions of dollars to Intel. So sound can be very valuable to companies, and still, even today, most companies ignore it completely. They don't think about it. So I did that for 20 years. I wrote a book called Sound Business about that, about how to make sound profitable in a business. And I got to do these TED Talks. First one was about the 4 effects of sound, which we can talk about. And that was the first TED Talk anybody had ever done where somebody actually used sound in a TED Talk. So they were quite excited about that. And that did pretty well. So I then got a chance to do 4 more, actually, in successive years. I'm not sure anybody's ever done that either. 5 successive TED Talks, culminating. Well, the second one was about healthy sound. The third one was about listening. The fourth one was about architects, asking them to start designing with their ears. And the fifth one, which is the one that went completely ballistic, was called How to Speak So That People Want to Listen. And it's about the skill of speaking. And that is now the 6th most viewed TED Talk of all time, amazingly. And I think collectively they've had over 160 million views, which is also quite awe-inspiring for me. Amazing. So then I wrote another book called How to Be Heard, which is about the skills of speaking and listening. And I moved on from the Sound Agency last year in order to focus on my mission for the rest of my life, however long I've got left, which is to generate listening in the world. That's what I'm all about. And that's what this book is about. So the new book is called Sound Effects with an A, a bit like the album by The Jam, if anybody knows that. Sound Effects, not effects. And it's about the relationship between humanity and sound. And I love the way you introduced it as a love letter to sound. I will keep that and use it if that's all right with you, because that's what it is. And here we are. So it's all about the book. It's all about generating listening in the world.
It's an amazing past. You and I met at TED, I think I can't remember, 2009, 2010. We're both drummers. I was listening to what you had to say and thinking about the process of drumming, where you're using all 4 limbs, you're decoding. And I think, you can play drums, or and that moves into being a drummer. And to me, that shift is when the mechanics are doing what you're doing are completely subconscious. And then you can listen to everything around you. And being a drummer, you can't really drum by yourself. You have to drum with other people, or other musicians on stage. And you're all about listening to what's going on around you. And what you're producing is subconscious. It's the same. I did contemporary dance for a long time. It's the same as that. Or learning a language is another one where, do you have to translate back to your native language, or do you dream in that language? But I really resonate with what you say about how being a musician helps you in so many different ways. As with every time I talk to you, you'll want, that could lead to 100 more questions, but I have a list of questions in the book, and I'm kind of going chronologically. What I would say to listeners is there's a whole lot of the book that I'm going to miss out about the sound of the earth, the sound of nature, the sound of humans. That's really, really fascinating. But I'm trying to focus on the bits that maybe are most interesting to our listeners. And the first question I want to ask you, diving into the book, is around this concept of PR being 80% about what you're saying and 20% about listening to your customers or the people you're communicating with, and how that's symptomatic of so much more in the act of both speaking and listening.
Yes, to me, there are two imbalances now in the world which work against listening. The first imbalance is eyes to ears. So we teach children how to read and write. We do not teach them how to speak or listen. So these primal forms of communication, which have been around, we've been evolving for 3 million plus years, and Homo sapiens has been around for 300,000 years, give or take. Language for about 150,000 probably. In all that time, we've used sound to learn, to connect, to communicate with each other until the last couple of 100 years. The tiniest proportion of our development since the Industrial Revolution, really, when two things happened. One is that reading got democratized. Before that, it had pretty much been the preserve of the elites. And, your average man in the street or woman in the street or farmer did not know how to read until quite recently. And the second thing that happened is we started making a lot of noise. Electromechanical, well, not electro then, but mechanical noise, and then electromechanical noise soon after. And we started to hermetically seal ourselves off from nature. Before that, actually, the invention of Windows was probably pretty critical in that. So we lost contact with the world we evolved in, the world we've been designed to live in, the environment and the soundscape particularly we've been designed to live in, which is natural sound. And so that's the first imbalance that we've over the last 200 years, and particularly the last 50 years since we invented screens, portable devices, email, text messaging, and particularly social media, the eyes have taken over. And the research now shows that many young people are much more comfortable with text communication than they are with speaking and listening, which is a concern, especially with AI coming. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, at some point, which is going to disintermediate a lot of people. And to me, what's left, the crucial skill that's left, is building trust-based relationships, which is about speaking and listening, not reading. You don't, I hope most people wouldn't tell somebody they love them for the first time in, a text. It's much more powerful to do face-to-face with your voice. So that's the first imbalance. And the second imbalance is between speaking and listening. So listening gets squashed in the first way, and then it gets squashed in the second way. My TED Talk on speaking has been seen by 5 times as many people as my TED Talk on listening. The research on organizational communication, organizational listening, found a very similar proportion, that roughly 4 to 5 times as much resource, effort, money goes into outbound communication as into inbound communication. Most organizations, if you talk about corporate communication, you immediately think PR, advertising, marketing, outbound. It's speaking. They're not good at listening. And that's actually what the organizational listening project found, a very big piece of research that looked at organizations from large to small, and found that they are basically abject at listening. Very, very poor. And it does matter, because the organizations ranked as the better listeners had longer staff retention, customer retention, happier customers and staff, all sorts of good markers, which are profitable markers. And the ones ranked as the least successful listeners, or the least good listeners, had more crises, conflict, and all sorts of bad things happening to them. So listening is profitable, and yet most organizations don't think about it at all, which starts with education, because we don't teach our children to think about it at all. So we've become increasingly ocular and increasingly absorbed in being heard and not listening to others. And a world where everybody wants to be heard and nobody's listening, that doesn't work very well, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I like your point about business as well. I've, for most of my career, run sales forces, and I used to preach to them, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. Salespeople, like many business people, basically the listening is the space in between speaking. You're just kind of rehearsing what you're going to say next. And truly, you become a much better salesman, you become a much better businessman, I would argue, a much better human being if you listen. It's not just in PR, it's in all elements of business, it's in politics, it's in everything.
So true. Actually, interestingly, if I can just say, since the book came out, I've just seen very recent research which shows that most salespeople have the proportion round completely the wrong way. The ideal proportion of speaking to listening, if you want to be in the sweet spot for closing your sales, is 40 to 60. 40 speaking, 60 listening. And the vast majority of salespeople do it the other way around, or at least that. Some of them are 70-30 speaking to listening. And that's not so effective. Of course it's not, because how can you sell to somebody if you're not listening to what they actually need, and if you don't understand them? And conscious listening, as I say in the book, and I'll say to anybody I ever talk to, conscious listening always creates understanding.
And one part of that salesmen are particularly bad at, and we're actually going to cover right at the end of this, hopefully, is silence. The idea of, if you've asked something and the person you're talking to hasn't said anything, don't just jump in and ask something else or try to clarify. Give them time. Let that period of discomfort be, in some cases. And it's a fascinating skill to master. Jumping on to and I'm, as I say, I'm doing it chronologically in throughout the book, but it'll seem like we're jumping into all sorts of different topics. I think there will be some themes that emerge, but what I'm going to go on to next is your writing on the way that sound affects your buying behavior, and starting with the work of Ronald Milliman, and talking more about behavioral habits of wine buyers with different music, some of the stuff that you mentioned about top 40 pop music leading to shorter shopping time. Can you talk more about that? And that was kind of you mentioned when you were talking about talking to business about sound. I imagine that was a lot of that discussion.
Yes, absolutely. Well, in fact, the vast majority of the research on sound and behavior, consumer behavior particularly, although I don't like the word consumer, but people's behavior when they're shopping, the vast majority of that research is about music. There's very, very, very little of it about any other form of sound. And of course, that's a bit of a shame, because when we're shopping, we're often surrounded by appalling sound, squeaking escalators, travelators, banging doors, noisy air conditioning systems, all sorts of stuff. It can get very loud in shopping malls without any music playing at all. And of course, some bright spark then looks up and goes, we've got a sound system which was designed for PAVA, never for music. And why don't we play some music? That'll be nice. So you walk around the shopping mall and all you can hear is, you can hear a bass, a snare drum just about, and that's it. So yes, music has been well researched, and what we do know is that music has profound effects on people when they're shopping. It affects their behavior significantly. Tempo first. There's a lot of research now to show that tempo entrains us. So in faster tempo, we do things faster. We walk faster, we eat faster, we drink faster, and if you extrapolate that to a shopping visit, we will often leave a store faster as well, which may not be desirable to the store owner. So, there are obvious mismatches here. You wouldn't play, pounding dance music in a fine dining restaurant because it's going to speed people up and make them leave faster, and you want them sitting there having an aperitif after they've eaten and enjoying the experience. So perhaps some slow classical music or something like that would be more appropriate. Music also has been shown to change what we buy. So a couple of famous studies. One is in a wine store in a restaurant, under a restaurant, I think it was, Arini and Kim. This one is where they played different musical conditions, and they found that classical music caused people to buy more expensive bottles of wine. So sales went up, not because people bought more wine, but because, a bit of Vivaldi playing. I'll tell you what, let's have a good bottle tonight, because we associate classical music with quality. So association is so important in the way that sound affects us. And then there's the famous study by Adrian North and Hargreaves and their colleagues in a supermarket where they had French and German wine on display with identical visual displays, and they alternated French and German music. On the French music days, French wine outsold German wine 5 bottles to 1, which may not be surprising. It does sell more generally. But on the German music days, German wine outsold French wine by 2 bottles to 1, which is a massive shift in purchasing behavior, and significantly, very, very few people even noticed the music. So sound is affecting us under our conscious level, subconsciously, unconsciously. Sound is affecting our bodies, our feelings, our thinking, and our behavior, including what we buy. Very powerful.
Yes, it's fascinating reading those studies. I'm going to talk to you a little more about music in commercial environments a little later. And you and I have talked, and you even wrote a little book when I was working at Biamp, also called Sound Effects. And one of the things that was mentioned in that was the order in which you look at sound. So you first consider the acoustics of the space. You then consider the noises in the space and taking out noises, HVAC, projectors, vending machines, that sort of stuff. You then build a sound system that just puts what you want where you want it and nowhere else. And then you consider what you want to put into the space. And that was a really powerful concept to me. And the bit that I'm involved in making gear is the third of those spaces. You have to get the first 2 right before you ever put any gear in. But in your book, you talk about the ABC of acoustics. And I'd like you to talk a little bit more about that.
Well, you're right, because it's impossible to make good sound in a noisy space in the first place. If you put even a beautiful sound system, even blue sound speakers with gorgeous music in a cafe where it's just cacophonous, you've got baristas banging, the acoustics are awful, what's the point? Putting that kind of lovely sound on top of noise is just more noise, unfortunately. So it doesn't work to try and ameliorate bad sound with good sound. It's like putting perfume on a bad smell. You just get a worse smell in the end. So yes, we start with acoustics, and the ABC of acoustics stands for absorb, block, cover. So it's kind of the basics of the whole profession. And you start by saying to yourself, all right, what kind of reverberation time do we want in this room? Do we want it live? Do we want it dead? Most rooms in the modern world are probably on the side of too reverberant, and a lot of them are way, way too reverberant. So, reverberation time is, roughly the time it takes for a sound to die away to nothing. So if you clap your hands in a cathedral, clap and then this long echo will happen. It might be 8 or 10 seconds until the sound's gone away completely. So you wouldn't want to have a rock gig in an environment like that, because the sound would just get mushed up and be very confusing. Whereas in an anechoic chamber, which you and I have both been in, I'm sure, there is no reverberation at all. And the sounds die away instantly. It's very disorientating, actually, to have that experience. Now, most rooms, as I've said, are too reverberant. A meeting room or a classroom where speech intelligibility is important should have a reverberation time of under half a second, ideally. It's certainly well under a second. That's critical. And there are so many of them that don't, especially old-fashioned classrooms where there's a strong reverberation and kids are just finding it very difficult to hear what the teacher's saying in that situation. And of course, the more reverberant a space is, if you've got noise going on in it, the noise escalates through a thing called the Lombard effect, where people speak louder in order to be heard, and then the next person speaks louder to get over that person, and it all escalates. You end up with a din. So that's absorb. And, even an open plan office should be a second or not much over, really. And many of them are way worse than that because architects love hard surfaces. So you get open plan offices with hard floor, hard ceiling, hard walls, all parallel surfaces, hard desks, and there's virtually nothing absorbing the sound in the space apart from the people. So let's listen to that first. Absorb to make it comfortable. Block is important for confidentiality. I mean, how many times have we all been in a room where we can hear the conversation next door? And that's not good if you're, giving somebody a pay rise or firing somebody, or you're a doctor giving a confidential diagnosis to somebody. We need privacy, whichever side of the Atlantic one is on. And that is afforded by blocking sound from moving. So it may be that you are blocking with a door. I mean, think of the number of times we've all stayed in a hotel and been woken up at 2 a.m. by the partygoers coming back. Well, attenuation is often not very good in those spaces. And sound is very smart. Even a small keyhole or any kind of little hole, it'll find its way through. So it does take good design. But if we can attenuate a reasonable amount down to, maybe an eighth of the sound coming through, then we can't hear or understand people in the next door room. That's important too. And there are now acoustic materials which look absolutely beautiful and do both of those two things. They can absorb and block at the same time, which is very exciting. And I've done a lot of work with my friends at Armstrong Ceilings in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I've seen their lovely materials. It really is exciting now that architects and designers can have things that look gorgeous and do a really good job at absorbing and blocking. If you can't, if you can't do either of those two things, or perhaps in other situations, you have to think about the C, which is cover. So there may be intrusive noise. Let's say you're in a school, you have a school that's near an airport. That's difficult. And the research shows it's also damaging because children in schools near airports are months behind their peers in other quieter spaces in reading ability, the research now tells us. So you want to cover perhaps street noise or noise from outside, and that you can do with masking sound. It's also very useful if you want to reduce speech intelligibility in a space, if you want to stop people from being distracted by other people. And that's, an office can be too quiet just as easily as it can be too noisy. So if you've got a pin quiet office, then 12 people sitting there working, one person takes a phone call, everybody is going to be disturbed. And it's also intimidating for the person to, Mum, can I call you back later, please? Because everybody's listening to you. So we can diffuse that with a masking sound. And that's typically been something like filtered pink or brown noise, which sounds just like a hiss. I don't think that's particularly healthy. And the research is now starting to indicate that kind of artificial noise is very effective, but it's also fatiguing. And it's just like, if you turn off the air conditioning at the end of the day in an office, everybody goes, oh, you didn't know that you weren't listening to this sound all day, but there it was. And there's a part of your brain that was going, I'm not listening to that. I'm still not listening to that. And it takes a bit of effort somewhere in order to blank it out. So there are much nicer sounds we can use for masking, natural sounds. And that's where I was delighted to be involved in the launch of moodsonic.com a couple of years ago, who are going great guns installing lovely biophilic soundscapes in offices for some very big companies now.
Yeah, that's fascinating. We work with MoodSonic to this day, and we'll continue to work in the future in providing the hardware for some of that work. And I love that this is all part of the well office movement and the way that people are thinking differently now about the workspace, particularly post-COVID, where people are still trying to get people to come back into the office space. My own opinion is remote work is very good for productivity, but terrible for creativity, and bringing people together physically allows much more creativity. I mean, we're seeing in the technology industry a real lag in innovation in the last few years. And I think part of that is because so many of the engineering departments around the world have had to spend time re-engineering products on components they can get during supply chain crises. But part of it is because we had that gap in bringing people together, being creative, sparking ideas. And we're seeing that filter through in terms of lack of product innovation.
I'm sure that's true. And, as I write in the book about the conversations I've had over the years with Jeremy Myerson, for example, Professor Jeremy Myerson, and Tim Oldman, who started the Leesman Index, it's pretty clear that the experts believe that in order to entice people back to do the things you're talking about, which I absolutely agree are critical and require community and social interaction, then we are going to have to rethink the office. Serried ranks of identical workstations, no. Noisy open plan offices, no. Myerson actually said, and I don't know if I quoted this in the book, the office of the future is going to have to be much more like an airport lounge, with good catering, comfortable seats, interesting, and a lot of areas where people can have happy conversations by accident, that kind of thing, the synchronicity, the creativity, just the joy of being together. So there will be a big change, I think, coming. And again, we'll need to be thinking about the sound of those spaces, because the other thing that's so missing in many, many offices is quiet working space, which is not just for types of work, although that's important. It's also for types of people. Diversity is now something we're much more aware of. And, there are people on the spectrum who don't perform or function very well at all in noisy environments. So we need to think about spaces where different kinds of work and different kinds of people can be most productive.
Yeah, and that's we work with and with MoodSonic, but the two of us work with Steelcase on designing office environments and building neighborhoods. And the other change is the idea of you not being in the same part of the office throughout the day, not just having your desk that you go to and you stay there and you get up at the end of the day and go home, but going to different spaces to do different things. So a focus space. Yeah, activity-based working, exactly. And I'll be fascinated to see how that moves into the mainstream and how offices morph into more productive and creative environments. As you say, and again, Steelcase, to shout out to them, work with some of our TED friends that talk about introversion and diversity, and designing, for example, office furniture for introverts and spaces for introverts, which, as an introvert myself, is great work, I think.
But what I'd love to see, which I'm not sure we're seeing yet, is a melting of the walls between the different kinds of people who are involved in this process. So I'd love to see acousticians involved with people in your industry, in the pro audio industry, much more closely. Because, as we said a few minutes ago, there's no point putting great sound into a noisy space. So there needs to be some work in order to prepare a space before the great sound goes in. And that's going to involve acousticians who are not great at selling themselves. I did a talk years ago called Why Nobody Listens to Acousticians. And, they tend to immediately start regaling you with equations about vibrations in soffits and whatever it may be. And I keep saying to them, it doesn't matter. If there's nobody in there, I don't care. It's about how sound affects people and how you can affect the sound that affects people. So it all comes down to people.
Yeah, and I think just before we move on, I want to move on to a related subject, but you talking about sound masking, more traditional sound masking, reminds me of being in a plane. There's another environment in which you're psychoacoustically cutting out the sound of the engines, and when you get out of the plane, you're exhausted. And that's one of the reasons you're exhausted, because you've been doing all of this mental work in a long flight. I'm just about to fly off to Australia, and that's like a 16-hour flight, and it's unpleasant.
Get the noise cancelling headphones on.
Yeah, I do. Build my own micro environment. So yeah, one initiative I wanted to talk about in relation to what you said about acousticians, and having gone to a number of Institute of Acoustics conferences, I can attest to the fact that they're a kind of insular bunch and difficult to communicate with, is the work that Arup have done in their sound labs. So for those of you that don't know, Arup is the world's largest multidisciplinary consultancy with at least 16,000 people around the world, 300 different disciplines, from structural engineering, where they started, to disciplines close to Julian and my heart, AV and multimedia, communications and acoustics. And they have these sound labs. And I was involved in fitting a number of them out with DSP technology. And this allows people to to model the sound of spaces before the spaces are built. And this is one of the big problems we have with acoustics. You don't know you've screwed it up until you've screwed it up. And then you're into remedial work that's difficult and expensive. And what Arup have been able to do is build these immersive environments and map acoustic models with architectural models to create the sound in the space before the space exists. So I know you've been into sound labs like I have. Can you talk about your experiences with them?
Yeah, it's very impressive being surrounded by a very large number of lovely Genelec loudspeakers, and having a multi-channel environment created in that way. Quite similar to we can talk about spatial sound a little bit later if you like, but the amazing experiences I've had in L-Acoustics High-Res system, which is jaw-dropping stuff as well. So you can do wonderful things with a lot of speakers, and that wonderful thing is allowing architects to listen to what they're building before, as you say, they build it, and that's very high level. So, I mean, it's a huge step forward, but it's not available to somebody who's designing a house down the road or, a small office building. What is available now, because, of course, technology moves apace and the whole thing filters down, is there are applications now available on PCs, laptops, which can do the same thing, not to the same degree. So you're not getting an immersive spatial experience, but you will certainly get a feeling of how the acoustic's going to be. There's a program called treble.tech, which is very good for architects, and which allows them to, with a pair of headphones, oralize a design and get some sort of a sense of, is this nice or is this nasty? So I think it's a great step forward, as you say, because, it has been a problem until now. They've had to guess. And very often they don't employ an acoustician who can make that guess very accurate. They don't employ them at the beginning of the process. Acousticians often have a miserable life because they get brought in at the end of the process when there's no money and there's a problem. Can you sort this out for us? We've got no money, but that's not a great existence, that one. So hopefully this will get architects listening much more avidly and at the beginning of the process, and we'll end up with much better sounding spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see that happen. And as you say, it would be great to see the kind of sound labs diffuse into a more accessible space, because that type of modeling that is expensive and time consuming. And Arup were only able to do it because they were commissioned by a very rich person to go and model the sound in 50 concert arenas around the world, concert halls around the world, and compare it to the actual sound. And they built the modeling software using a combination of a number of softwares that can accurately model that. You mentioned treble. They've kind of gone through a little bit of a what's called in business called a pivot into more of a data acquisition company. Their pivot has been kind of unfortunate for what we're talking about, because they're getting away from doing what they started off doing. That was so
sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's
somebody will take up the lead in that. There's a huge demand for this, a huge need for this. So I'm sure, just as with music software, you can design anything on a laptop now, and there's plenty of very sophisticated convolution reverb software that's been developed for making music and so forth. So winding that round the other way and convolving spaces should be possible these days.
Yeah, and it's going to affect. It's going to be affected by as you mentioned, and we will talk about in a minute. Immersive audio becoming more mainstream. Before we get off architects and people, you brought up a really interesting point that I hadn't really thought about until I read the book. But it's one of a number of things you say that just you think, oh yeah, I should have thought of that. And that's about architects and how they design with their eyes and their ears, and not their ears really. A lot of people in our industry, in the audio industry, feel that architects are our enemies and they're willfully designing bad sounding buildings just because. I don't think that. I think that they design with their eyes, and as you say, a lot of the current trends are around the use of concrete and metal and glass that are very reflective materials. But you made a great point about architects using sight to get awards, because awards are based mainly on pictures of their work rather than people going in and experiencing the work. And they build a building that looks great on pictures but is almost impossible to inhabit because it sounds so bad. And you said that, and I thought, of course, I didn't even think about that. That was a great realization that you brought to my mind. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, actually, that kind of came out of my interview with Barry Blesser, who wrote the lovely book, Spaces Speak, Are You Listening?, which I recommend to anybody who's interested in oral architecture. And, I was expecting, when I spoke to him, I was expecting Barry to be, was it 15 years after the book or something like that, to be quite enthusiastic about progress. Quite the reverse. He was extremely unhappy about progress, actually. And he said there are two reasons. Reason one, architects want to win the next job. Reason two, architects want to win awards. And both of those two things are achieved by visual means, entirely visual means. Sound doesn't come into it at all. So if an architect wants to show you their past work, they'll show you pictures or models. They see how it looks. It's lovely. Well, you don't get the feeling, the sensory experience of actually being in the space, as you say, which can be appalling. And, I remember in the early days of the sound agency having to do remedial work on the installations of some very, very famous architects in London, including City Hall, where I won't name the architect, but they had designed a cafeteria with a curving glass wall on the outside, a curving glass wall on the inside, a stone floor, a hard concrete roof. Well, you can start imagining how that sounded. It was just cacophonous. And there was a sort of serving station with dishwashers and all sorts of machinery, fridges and so forth going. It was just horrible. And we had to put up mushroom type, which was all that was available back in those days, with suspended acoustic panels to damp the whole space down. So, it's so common. And of course, the training is the other aspect here. Architects in America train for 5 years. They might spend a week, maybe even 2 days on sound in that 5 years. So again, going back to my imbalances at the beginning, the imbalance from the eyes to the ears is enormous. And of course, from speaking to listening as well. So if you think about speaking as outbound and communicating outwards, that's kind of much more what architects are into, even if they consider oral aspects at all. So yeah, it's not surprising. I mean, I don't think the answer is to see them as demons. The answer is education, engagement, and encouragement. And that's what I've been doing. I mean, for example, in December, I did a lovely talk to the American Institute of Architects, and it was the most attended educational talk they've ever had. We had 1,000 architects attending that webinar, and it was really well received. Huge responses from the wall. So I am now gauging that there is a thirst for this in the profession, and I very much hope we're going to see some real changes. Now they've got the tools and the desire to make buildings that sound as good as they look.
I hope that's true. I really hope that's true. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about another unintended consequence of architecture, which was, I think it's in London, the building that has this kind of concave glass that was focusing sun rays and melting car mirrors, because they hadn't thought about that. And they built a building that looks fabulous, but melts things. And moving on to a related subject, which is, I was going to say controversial. It's not really controversial, but it's a little, what would I say? It's against what we do, which is around the trend of piping music everywhere. And you talk about the organization, the Pipe Down in the UK, about having less music in spaces. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and I've got some thoughts about that as well.
Well, so any commercial space needs the soundscape to be carefully designed. That's the first thing. So not thinking about it at all, or just whacking some music in because everybody else does it. Those are not good options. And that's mindless, and it's thoughtless, and it is not considering the impact you're having on who are the people in your space, what is going to make them happy, make them stay longer. How are you doing this? What's the noise level? We talked about getting rid of noise. What are the acoustics like, and so forth. So really thinking about sound in the space from the ground up: acoustics, noise control, sound system, and content. Those four things is absolutely critical. Now, music may be the best choice. Absolutely. I'm not against music. I love music, of course. What I'm against is mindless or inappropriate music, as we just talked about, in a shopping mall, played through a PAVA system that can't handle it and just sounds dreadful. Or, for goodness sake, in so many shops we've been in, which have got very low quality sound systems, and they're pounding out distorted or hideous music. Don't get me started on telephone on hold music, for God's sake. I mean, really? The number of times we have to hold the phone out here because there's some distorted, awful mush coming that they just haven't tested. Nobody's obviously sat and listened to that. So thinking about what you're delivering, how you're delivering it, and to whom you're delivering it, and what for, those are crucial elements, designing with the ears. Now, as long as you're doing that, it may well be that if you're, I don't know, Hollister or something like that, and you've got a particular audience, which is young adults who like the surfing pictures, and it is them who do that, isn't it? I think so. I'm not their target audience. And they like the kind of nightclubby thing. Go for it. I mean, you're creating a vibe there which will keep people like me out. And that's the intention. So that's conscious design. You're filtering people and giving the people you want what they want. So thinking about that as a design aspect is quite exciting. I always think, why don't people start designing with the, it's exciting. It's another whole dimension. And that's really what the book is all about, is drawing back the curtain on this entire dimension of existence, of consciousness, of presence as human beings, of relationship, and of course, of commercial existence. Drawing back the curtain and opening this new dimension of sound and getting intentional, conscious about the sound that we're creating. And that was, very much the subject of my first book, Sound Business, as well. It was tracking through all these things. Why aren't people asking the question, how does our brand sound? What's the soundscape we're imposing on customers in our shops? For goodness sake, don't let the shop staff choose the music, for example, and don't put the same thing on every day, which drives people nuts. And try not to be, anodyne, me too, boring. The music that is in your shop is probably the music in the next door shop. Well, that's not saying anything about your brand. So thinking carefully about what your brand sounds like, what's the spirit, what's the relationship that you want to have with people. Music may be the right sound, or it might be some other sound entirely. It might be nature sound. It could be a designed soundscape, which we've never heard before. Who knows? There are all sorts. Sound is so broad. That's why I called my company the Sound Agency, not the Music Agency, because music is only one kind of sound. Although, of course, within music, you've got an infinite variety from, ambient to death metal. Pick your point and brand it. Think about genres, styles, artists who are resonant with you, not just the bland stuff that's suggested by some pipe music company. And get a good system. Of course, Blue Sound speakers sound lovely, and that's why people should invest in them. That's half the problem, of course. We go back to architects, and it's not just them; it's the quantity surveyors or the people down the process who say, "Do we really need $200 loudspeakers? I'm sure we could get much. It's just the same: $50, $25. That's enough. They're just a loudspeaker. No. You're going to kill people. You're going to get people really tired, fractious, stressed, and unhappy with distorted sound that doesn't work very well. And what's it say about your brand if you cheapskate the way it sounds?
Yeah, we're working a lot with brands with retail media strategies where they're being much more intentional about what they're putting in. Often they're linking them to apps so that you can, for example, listen to the music. They're taking a much more active curation role and hoping to drive business and community by more intentionally looking at sound and often music. I agree with you, by the way, that it doesn't always have to be music. There's also, I think, a very, very narrow window between too quiet and too loud. If it's too quiet, it's what you're talking about. You can just hear a kind of tss, and it's just objectionable. If it's too loud, you can't talk. If you walk into a space where they've actually nailed it, both in terms of having a system that can reproduce great audio, and they've got it at exactly the right level, it's fantastic. And every time I walk into those spaces, I exhale and go, yeah, they've nailed it. We could talk so much more about this, but there's one other area I really want to get into, which I think would be really exciting. And I'm going to start that by getting your thoughts on, you wrote some really interesting stuff about Mark Ronson's comments on vinyl. I remember being at the TED with you, where Mark was curating and creating on the fly. And I remember him spinning in the sound of your voice as one of the stems in his work, and being with you. It was delightful to watch your face light up as you heard yourself come back out, mixed by this star. But talk to me a little bit about your conversation with him about vinyl.
Well, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Because digital has changed music entirely. And I was reading Stephen Wilson's book the other day, and he was reflecting on something which I talk about in the book as well, which is just the quantity. When I grew up, there was so much music that there was not so much music that I couldn't keep up. There was a few key albums released every week or month. You knew what was going on. Now, there's more music released in a single day than was released in a year back in the 70s or 80s. You can't keep up. It's an unbelievable tidal wave of content, and I don't like that word, but there's so much music. And that's because we've democratized the tools of production. So it's all being produced, a lot of it's being produced by people on their own, on a Mac, in their bedroom or whatever, using very sophisticated tools and churning out stuff. Now, there's been obviously a, I won't say a race to the bottom, but the quality of a lot of that music is less than sublime. And it's harder to find the things that are sublime because the noise level is so enormous in the system. And it's also true to say that many younger people today find the concept of an album alien. They listen to a tune and they don't even care who the tune's by. It's not that they do what I used to do, which is, semi-religiously follow an artist and know all the musicians associated with that artist and who produced it and who played bass on that. And, it's kind of like a devotional thing. Nope, they just like a tune. Don't even care who it's by. So there's a lot of FEAT in song titles, isn't there? It's not really important. It's a producer featuring some vocalist who may or may not happen again. Not many people have got, I'm obviously part J, Taylor Swift and the Swifties. Those things still go on to a degree, but the vast majority of music is made by individuals solo on their own and consumed by individuals on their own, digitally on headphones or whatever it may be. So music used to be a social thing once upon a time. And that's kind of gone apart from live performance now. But that's why I was very reassured and enthused when Mark Ronson was talking about the resurgence of vinyl, because there's a relationship there. It's not just a tune. It's a piece of work. It's almost an oeuvre. It's an artist's intention that you are submitting to. So you're being much more the recipient of a designed piece of work. And you have to get up halfway through and turn the thing over, as we used to do in the old days. So there's a kind of active participation there. But the rest of it is, as he said, it's important because you don't have a level playing field here. There are good tracks and bad tracks. And the bad tracks make the good tracks so much better. And I thought one of the interesting things he said about the way albums are often made today is, you get a singer, an artist who employs a dozen of the top producers, and each of them is competing to have the bangingest tune on the album. So you get this kind of brick of shouty, completely out there stuff where everything has got to be the biggest and best and loudest. And that's not the way things work very well. It's tiring, it's exhausting, and you need the valleys to have the peaks. You need the dark to have the light. You need light and shade in an album. You need pace changes and so forth. So if it's true, and he was also referencing the return of people preferring paper books to Kindles and that kind of reading. Well, I hope those things are true, because I think there's great joy and value in a physical relationship with a product. And we also see that, don't we, in the way many artists are marketing themselves and now have, yes, you can play it on Spotify, or you can, download it and, have it your own. But then most artists are now offering completely different tiers, all the way up to the, very expensive box set with the booklet and so on and so forth. So there are degrees of involvement with music now, which perhaps didn't happen in the old days. It's changed a great deal. It's more subtle, but I think the people who are doing it very well, so, Imogen Heap, Stephen Wilson does that very well as well, then they are really forging a relationship that's much more profound with their audience.
Yeah, I think, again, there's 100 different directions we could go off in here. There's this concept, and it's nowadays artists have to do a lot more than produce music. They often have to manage social media strategies. They've got to be a lot of things, combined with the fact that a lot of the platforms that are breaking musicians now are very short attention span. TikTok, YouTube. And what that's leading to, I think, is artists that can produce one good track, but can't produce a body of work. And it's tiring. It's one-dimensional. It's superficial. You, as you say, you have an album full of bangers, or you might have an artist that's got one great track. And this has always happened. This has always been, do you buy an album that has a single and a load of filler tracks, or do you buy an album that, as you say, has quality content throughout and has light and shade and peaks and troughs, and the satisfaction of that. There's a lot of stuff going on at the moment. I'm doing a lot of work and listening a lot to people talking about this concept of what it is to be an artist now, and where record companies don't do what record companies used to do, and the artist is having to do more of that themselves, and that's taking away from time that they have to produce and perform music. And also, the one that's heard the most is not necessarily the best musician, but the best marketer. And it's really interesting. And you also talked about this idea about variety of content. And there's this concept of lean back listening and lean forward listening, and how we can move people from being passive consumers of playlist-driven music to active participants, and move them along that path from a really passive consumer, ultimately, if they want to go that far, to be a highly engaged superfan, like you mentioned Imogen Heap and Imi's Heapsters, Neil Young Archives, his evangelical following. You mentioned the Swifties, but if you look to Asia, you've got K-pop and J-pop, and they're absolutely adored by their fans. Africa is another area where musicians become kind of deities, and it's really interesting to see how globally some of that is happening.
Yeah, definitely. And I think given the tidal wave, it is possibly one area where AI may help us. So something like Claude, which is very amenable, I think, and polite and helpful a lot of the time. Certainly has shortened a great number of my internet searches. I just ask Claude and he gives me the answer immediately. So, hey, Claude, I listened to this, this, and this. Can you name any 3 great albums I should listen to in the next month?
Mm-hmm.
I think that the kind of trusted guide modality is going to be very helpful, and as one of the most helpful bits of AI in the future.
Yeah, we're actually using AI a lot for curation now, where exactly that, can you, whether you use Claude or ChatGPT or DeepSeek or, whatever your AI of choice, can you curate me 100-track playlist for a tiki bar on a Friday night in Portland, Oregon, featuring predominantly local artists? And it's becoming really good at that. You then have the issue of authenticity. So Spotify, for example, are making a lot of tracks that are not actually produced by real people, so they don't have to pay royalties on those tracks. And there's this concept of authentication through the signal path. And again, we at Lenbrook are doing a lot of work on that. And Imi is doing some really valuable work with her Oracles project that she's doing with Andy Kahn, who I think you also know. Have you come across Oracles and the digital identity stuff she's building there?
No, I know she was very involved in, blockchain kind of concepts of authenticating artists' work in ways that didn't require the old lumbering copyright process. So that's all very exciting. I think that's wonderful to hear, and that is very much the future, I think.
Yeah, I think so. There's a dark side to it, and musicians, I'm sure you saw the news, because I think it was mainly in England, of musicians producing an album of basically silence. So Kate Bush was involved in that, and I think Imi was involved as well, and just recording the sound of recording studios with no one in them, because that was actually what it was going to be like if AI took over.
Absolutely. Yeah. One hopes the government is going to change its mind on that ridiculous proposal they had, but we'll see.
Yeah. Both the UK and American government are not setting good examples for putting guide rails around AI. I'm very excited by AI, but I'm also aware that it's got a huge dark side as well, and we have to be super mindful in every element, from TDM laws to data set biases. But actually, that album leads me into the very last bit I wanted you to comment on, which is silence. And the very end of your book, you talk about silence.
The most important sound you could easily make a case for, really, because it's the bass line, and it's the thing that makes all sound make sense. It's the gaps between the words, the gaps between the notes that cause meaning. So again, it's valleys and peaks, isn't it? And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people have lost contact with silence, just as they've lost contact with nature sound, because more than half the world lives in cities now. And the forecast is that within a few years, it'll be 2/3, even 3/4 of the world living in cities. And that means completely cut off from that soundscape that we've evolved to, that I talked about earlier: wind, water, birds, natural sound, gone. And that is a real problem. And equally, silence, gone. So you get people who live in cities going to stay with their friends in the country and going, I can't sleep, it's so dry, it's so quiet, because they find it spooky. That's a problem. We need to reacquaint ourselves, befriend silence, really re-engage with silence. As Evelyn Glennie said in her wonderful DVD, Touch the Sound, silence is a sound. It's a very important sound. Mm-hmm. And it's not homogeneous. There are different qualities of silence, all sorts. I talk about that in the book. But really, if we are stuck in a city, it's important to seek it out. It might mean locking yourself in a toilet or something. A couple of times a day, just try and get a few minutes of silence to reset your ears, recalibrate them, and get back to the baseline, which helps you to listen afresh. And there are some good initiatives that I talk about in the book. You've got Shinrin-yoku, of course, forest bathing, which is becoming quite a big movement around the world. People going out from the city and walking in beautiful natural places quietly without saying anything and listening. Well, that's a lovely thing to do. Then there's a couple of nature sound experts I talk about in the book. My old friend Bernie Krause, of course, but also Gordon Hampton, who had that book, One Square Inch, where he was trying to defend that square inch stone in the middle of a national park not far from where you are now, and failed. In fact, I mean, it was quite ironic. They made it so it was so quiet that the US Army Air Force, I think, or the Navy, discerned that it was very low population and therefore a great place to be flying low altitude sorties over as training missions. So it's now very far from silent, unfortunately. So he failed.
Yeah.
But that kind of kicked off something which I think is a great movement, which is Quiet Parks International, where he's working with other people to create a kind of international catalogue of quiet places, whether they're in cities, like, the High Line in Manhattan, or Highgate, Hampstead Heath, in London, parks in Barcelona. There are places, some cities are louder than others, but there are places that one can go and get closer to silence. So they have a kind of registration system, and it's a place where people can suggest their own favorite places. Well, that's great, I think, because it shows a need for this, and it makes it more public. And I think if we can get people to start re-engaging with the idea that silence is good, particularly, of course, if you're speaking. I mean, if you don't have comfort with silence, you're not going to be a good speaker. You need to be able to leave gaps. As you said, in selling, the close, absolutely crucial. Just sit there looking at them, and don't be tempted to follow up with another question. So, do you want it? That's it, no more. And if you're on a stage speaking, if you're not comfortable with silence, you'll start gabbling and doing and I means and ums and ers and all the rest of it. So being comfortable with silence, I also have in the book the lovely meditations from the island of San Giuliano in Lake Orta in Italy, which are really worth spending time with. In the silence, you meet yourself. In the silence, you meet the master.
Mm-hmm.
Those kind of lovely meditations, there's I think 13 or 14 of them, which, it's lovely to spend a couple of minutes in silence looking at them and reflecting on what they bring up for you. So yes, silence is beautiful. I'm not saying the world should be silent. I love all sound. Well, no, not all sound, but I love sound in general. It's what the book is really about is becoming conscious of the effect that sound is having on us and the effect that we're having on the sound of the world. And as you say, there's a great deal in the book about the sound of humanity and how we're impinging on nature with the noise that we're making. So it's about that conscious relationship. It's revitalizing that and generating listening in the world. And, you look at the politics in the world around us right now, I think most people would not disagree with me when I say, I think never has the world needed listening more than it does now.
Well, that's a great way to end. I'm going to ask you at the end how people can contact you, and I think there's something you want to talk about. But thank you so much. We hope you like this episode and want to listen to more. We release new episodes every Tuesday. They're available at your favorite podcast apps, although the easiest place to find everything related to Surroundscapes is at surroundscapes.bluesoundprofessional.com. So where can people find out more about you, Julian, and what would you like to close with?
Well, three things really, I suppose. First of all, my website, if people want to talk to me about any kind of engagement or ask questions, juliantreasure.com. Simple. Second thing is the book, of course, which is, you can find it in all the usual places, Sound Effects with an A. And, you'll find there's some lovely comments from people who've read it already. And I'm very grateful for your lovely comments as well, Graham. It's so encouraging to me to have this really positive reaction from people like Chris Anderson of TED and Susan Cain and Stephen Bartlett, who does the podcast Diary of a CEO and so forth. It's lovely. So the book is out there. And the third way is I'm starting a new society, a new community, an online community called the Listening Society, which is a haven for people who are interested or concerned about sound and about listening. And you can find that at www.thelisteningsociety.community. And the doors open on May the 1st, and I don't know if that's in the past or in the future when this goes out. But either way, I would love to see you there. And that is going to be a place where people can come and ask questions, share their experience, share their issues, and find an absolute treasure trove of documents and audio and video stuff all about sound and about listening. So I'm so excited about that.
So am I. I'm going to be an early visitor to that on the 1st of May. I'll be there. And once again, this book is amazing. Those meditations that you mentioned late on in our talk are in here. I've noted them down and go back and look at them. Thank you so much, Julian. This has been such a pleasure.
Oh, for me too, Graham. Always is. And I hope to see you in the flesh very soon.